And we are so pleased to have returning Felicia Zavarella-Stadelman for our virtual art history program tonight on the art of love. We thought that would be a good lecture for the month of February here, just past Valentine's Day. And we are excited that the Hudson Library is the first audience that gets to hear this new lecture that Felicia's been working on. So thank you for holding out for the Hudson Library to hear your first
Absolutely.
First try at this one. Yeah, we're excited to hear this one. Felicia, if you don't know Felicia, she's been a long time speaker at the Hudson Library, and we are pleased to have her back. She started about 7-8 years ago doing her Through the Eyes of the Artist lectures at the library, and she has always been one of our most popular speakers and always demand to have her back. So we're very excited to have her back with us tonight. Felicia is our local art historian. But she goes all over, and she's even has a Paris premiere that she did a documentary on Mary Cassatt and Edgar Degas. So she has international fame now, not just local fame.
So we
are so happy to have you with us tonight, Felicia, for the art of love. And we look forward to hearing all about it. Your audience, if you have any questions during the program, there is a Q&A box at the very bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and put your questions in at any time, and then we'll hold off until the end of the program where we'll take some questions for Felicia. So thank you, Felicia, and thank you to our patrons for joining us tonight.
Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen, and let's see, here we go. Did it work? Can you see me?
Yes.
All right, perfect. I can't wait till the day that we're back together again. I really miss all of you, and I've had a lot of people contact me to say, when are you going back into the library? I think we're trying to make the best of everything this year, and I'm hoping that by the end of the year we're going to be getting out of our offices at home and talking to people face to face. So this is the first time I've done this presentation for an audience. Of course, I've practiced it a million times, but what a great story. There's a lot going on in the world of love, and I'm anxious to share the story with you. So music might be the food of love, but art has also acted as a very powerful aphrodisiac. And it's often said that the greatest artists also had the greatest love affairs. So in order to be so in touch with your creativity, you need to be deeply in touch with your emotions and your passions and your desires. And your feelings of love are at the foundation of some of the most beautiful masterpieces. Legendary couples have notably made their mark in history, in the history of art, through their extraordinary relationships that they've documented on canvas. While some confront each other, find fulfillment through their creations, others experience kind of a tragic fate. I'm hoping that this lecture offers you an overview of all of these different forms of love that combine passion and creation. Art history is saturated with great love stories of artists who inspired each other, formed intensive partnerships, not only in love, but also in their art. Couples who shook each other and created this dynamic all around them through their artwork. These qualities highlight some of the most fascinating and inspiring loving couples in art. Some of the greatest art arises from the tension that's between the artist and the muse, for example. But what if both parties are fiercely creative? So let's take a look at couples whose intense passions has sparked the work and inspired each other's best works to come out of that jealousy, out of the intense love, out of the sexual tension, anxiety to become an artist in their own right. Let's talk first about William Bugaro and Elizabeth Jane Gardner. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, up-and-coming American artists would head to Paris, the world art capital, seeking to gain technical proficiency in drawing and painting and to enhance their reputations. The master, William Adolphe Bugaro, was a respected leader and was commercially, critically acclaimed as a successful artist. And many artists were attracted by this larger-than-life personality and the excellent reputation that he had in both France and in America during the second half of the 19th century. And for students looking for an example of the established French academic art, there is no better master than William Bugaro. He was energetic and outgoing and generous, a major figure in the international art world, and a favorite among American collectors. So he, as a teacher, was considered to be a sacred teacher, and he felt very emotionally connected to his students. He gave freely of his time, his advice, and his friendship to his students, and associations that he had with his students. He always said that they made me feel young at heart throughout my life. So as a teacher, Bugaro instructed his polished academic style with this emphasis on classical composition, accurate draftsmanship, drawing and painting from live models. And that was a skill that many artists wanted to learn from him. And he delivered valuable critical judgments and championed all of his young American students. About 40% had of the students that he had in his very prestigious Paris salon, or his education atmosphere, about 40% of those students that were in his drawing and painting classes were accepted into the very prestigious Paris salon. So not coincidentally, he was a very powerful person that artists wanted to learn from, because they knew that once they mastered his style, or if he was interested in their work, that he could pull them into the salon and get them accepted into the salon. So he didn't insist that his students imitate his personal academic manner, but he did urge them instead to utilize the skills that they had honed, to develop their own style and subjects. And he had a lot of impact on the output of these artists during this time. Now, after graduating from LaSalle College with a degree in art, Elizabeth Gardner taught for some time, and she became very instrumental in founding the School of Design in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it was then that she was awakened to the realization that, in her words, the foundation of good painting is correct art. And at that time, Paris was the mecca of American and European artists, and Elizabeth was determined to go there to learn how to draw. So soon after the Civil War, she and a teacher friend of hers set out for France. Now, it never occurred to her, she said in later years, that she would have any trouble being accepted as a student. She was accepted in many schools in the US, and she didn't realize that Parisian schools were not admitting women. So her hair had been cut short because of an illness that she had in the US. And so she decided, since she had this short haircut, that she would go to Paris and study as a young boy. So dressed in boys' clothing, she applied at France's great drawing school, L'École des Beaux-Arts, and she was accepted as a young man. And each day she crossed Paris as a boy, and then would dress in her own clothes and return back to her apartment at night as a young woman. Now, professors and students alike were very much aware of this, of the sex of this droll American, they would call her. People knew that she was putting on this facade, but no one made any objection to her presence in the studio. They knew that she was doing what she needed to be able to gain access to education. She was the only student of Bugaro's who actually consciously adopted his highly finished, stylized work. This is the work of Elizabeth Gardner, which looks so much like Bugaro's work. And to her critics, she responded by saying, "I would rather be known as the best imitator of Bugaro than nobody." Now, the similarities in their style and their subject matter between Bugaro and Gardner's work is very, very striking. Incidentally, it was William Bugaro who single-handedly opened the French academies to women. Up until the time that he was a leader of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, women were not accepted into these schools, and he finally made a change and had women accepted there. Now, Bugaro was now a widower, and he lived with his daughter and his mother across the courtyard from Elizabeth's studio apartment, and it wasn't long before teacher and pupil were deeply in love. By the end of 1877, Bugaro began mentioning to his family that he had an interest in one of his students, Elizabeth Jane Gardner, an American from New Hampshire, 12 years his junior, who had settled in Paris. William was 52 years old at the time. But his daughter Henrietta, who was now 20, whose mother was William's first wife, she incidentally had died after the birth of their third child. And more particularly, Bugaro's mother were so opposed to the idea of him being connected with one of his students that they made him not speak of it anymore. In fact, his mother made him swear not to even think of remarrying before her own death. Henrietta, his daughter, even threatened to join a convent if it ever came up again. So Bugaro kept his promise, although he and Elizabeth were secretly engaged in May of 1879. Elizabeth Gardner said his mother believed that two painters in a family were too much for domestic happiness. Now, in February of 1896, Bugaro's mother eventually died at the age of 92. And William and Elizabeth were married after a 17-year engagement. He was 71, Elizabeth was 59. And they were to have 10 wonderful years together before his death. Elizabeth Jane Gardner decided to put her own career as an artist on hold and dedicate herself to the life of her husband, the artistic life of her husband. She was very devoted, always at his side, acted as his secretary for the voluminous correspondence that he had, papers, speeches. Criticism aside, she did achieve great success, but William Bugaro has been enthusiastically rediscovered over the last several decades, especially by American collectors, but still not Elizabeth Gardner. Let's take a look at the next couple that it has inspired each other. That's Gustav Klimt and Emily Floja. Now, before Coco Chanel was there was Emily Floja. She was a designer in the fashion industry. She was Gustav Klimt's muse. She was fearless, a trailblazer. She inspired some of the 20th century's most iconic paintings with the clothing that she wore, that she created on her own, that were painted by Gustav Klimt. And in Klimt's iconic painting of The Kiss, a couple embraces in their gold leaf flecked robes as they swirl together into this scintillating pattern. And many people believe that based on the journals of Emily Floja, that this couple represents Gustav Klimt and Emily, who had this decades-long romance that generated this bold, envelope-pushing creative collaboration between the two of them. But while Klimt's highly controversial portraits scandalized collectors and propelled him into the spotlight, Floja was a successful businesswoman, fearless, designer. She was a hidden gem, largely unknown and unrecognized in the fashion industry until she started displaying some of her clothes. Coco Chanel is often heralded as the sole designer to revolutionize modern women's wear. And it's true that she popularized trousers and comfortable two-piece suits at a time when upper-class women had limited tailored options. But by the time Chanel had opened her salon in 1910, Floja had already been producing cutting-edge designs in Vienna for several years, already carving out new roles for women in the industry with her new empire waist garments, wide sleeves, intricately styled panels inspired by Hungarian and Slavic embroidery. And it made a real departure from the restricted corseted dresses that were the mainstays for women's clothing at the time. Emily created this direct, hands-on role in production of this clothing. She would pin fabrics to dummies, custom make these clothes to the client's proportions before ever directing fabric cutters to reassemble the clothes. Floja, interestingly, displayed her clothes with alluring art objects that were not necessarily for sale, but she included inlaid boxes, tortoiseshell combs, marbled paper notebooks, silver chalices, hand-carved wooden dolls to emphasize the clothing. And her store was furnished with sleek, adjustable mirrors, geometric carved wooden chairs, and black and white checkered tables. Her art-oriented aesthetic and playful approach to retail design really set a precedent for the contemporary store concept, like Colette's in Paris, for example, and Dover Street Market in London. Many of those retailers said that they modeled their areas where they showed their clothes after the way that Emily Floja displays much of her work with the artwork, the clothing with her artwork. So the salon's 30 years in business is a real testament to Floja's business smarts. And she drew on a wide client base and catered to an international audience that included very many women, American women. The store's elaborate logo was this Art Nouveau style of text with a checkered border motif. And it was printed on invoices and labels. And it turned this icon, this kind of a brand that she created very early on, which was called Schwestern Floja, into an easily recognizable brand. It was, incidentally, it's pronounced Svetzen. I'm sorry, I pronounced it the wrong way. Svetzen. And this was the logo for the Floja sisters who had created this line of clothing. Now, Gustav Klimt never married or committed to any one woman, but he did have numerous lovers. And he seemed to have an insatiable sexual appetite. Visitors to his studio were often surprised to find at least 2 or 3 women lounging around in their underwear. Models would lounge around his studio, and the way he described it was he had them naked and available for artistic or any other kind of inspirational activity. His sensual works provided a very clear insight into his attitudes towards sexuality and women at the time. Now, Emily Floja was known to be the woman that was closest to his heart, even though he was with many women. And she became Klimt's lifelong companion. She was the sister of his brother Ernst's widow. She was very attractive, sophisticated, strong-willed, free-spirited, and Gustav Klimt and Emily Floja were inseparable for years. The story of their relationship lasted for 27 years until Gustav Klimt's death. Now, he was a famous womanizer, but he lived with his mother until her death, and that was only 3 years before he eventually died. He allegedly fathered over 40 children. 16 of them were recognized by the state. 14 of them showed up after his death to claim his fortune. Eventually, he died from a stroke on January 11th, 1918. His last words were, "Get Emily." She inherited half of his estate, and the other half went to a variety of people in his family. After Klimt's death, Floja continued to operate her clothing business until 1938, when the salon eventually closed after the Austrian changed into Nazi Germany. And Floja never married. Eventually, she died in 1952. Unfortunately, in the final days of the Second World War, her house caught fire, destroying not only her collection of garments, but also very valuable art objects from the estate of Gustav Klimt. Our next couple is Amadeo Modigliani and Jean Ebertarn. The name of Jean Ebertarn is inseparable from that of Amadeo Modigliani. And surprisingly and very sad, the truth was that her death rather than her life is what tied the two of them together. In the history of art, she is bestowed with the honorable role as the young artist and mentor of Modigliani, who was a very important student at the Accademia Rossi, but more importantly, she was known as Modigliani's muse. Live fast and die young was the phrase that was coined by the 20th century sculptor and painter Amadeo Modigliani, and it certainly was true in this case. History, culture, and the arts have given us many of those tortured geniuses, cult figures who indulged recklessly, lived decadently throughout wild times, created passionately, and had incredible loves of their life. But Modigliani's life, there is no comparison. He was a true bohemian, a Lothario, a dark, moody prince of Paris, but art historians prefer to call him the troubled lover of Jean Ebertarn. Rather than examine the accuracy of this Modigliani legend, whether he really was an immoral, depraved myth that many of us believe, let's just find some truths out about Modigliani. He was an alcoholic, he was a drug addict, he was sickly. As a youth, he was afflicted with several serious illnesses, so he did have that tragic life, pleurisy, typhoid fever, tuberculosis. And his sickly health would plague him throughout his adulthood, and also provided this rationale for this fantastic attitude he had later in life, which was to live free and die young. Modigliani was also a womanizer. He was a dark, handsome, brooding fellow with good looks. He attracted beautiful women. Jean was born in Paris to a strict Roman Catholic family, and she aspired to be an artist and was introduced to the Montparnasse artist community through her brother André, who himself was an artist. She modeled for several painters and sculptors, but eventually she enrolled in the Accademia Rossi for her own artistic training. There in the spring of 1917, she meets the charismatic Modigliani, who was called Modi by his friends, and almost immediately the couple fell in love. He was 15 years her senior. Now, before he met Jean, he had more than his share of lovers and affairs, and it was as if no woman in Paris could resist this charming sexual appeal of this bad boy. But Jean, who was the shy, delicate, gentle, innocent young woman, he found in her a person who he said came closest to a true companion. And he had written in his journals that he had a best hope for a deep and meaningful relationship with her. She was quite magnetic towards him. She was very shy. She always had that little shy girl gaze. Many people noted that they never really heard her speak. She had a lot to deal with. In addition to this high maintenance lover that she was with, she had a conservative family who took tremendous issue with her romantic involvement with Modi. They objected vehemently for a lot of reasons. First of all, he was penniless, a penniless artist who wasn't selling much of his work. Secondly, he was considered to be a living degenerate. And also, he was Jewish. So what did Jean do? She actually told her family that she wished to abandon them for the man that she loved. She defied her family to be with him, and she disowned them actually legally and went off to live with Modigliani faithfully and ultimately to her own demise. Now, unmarried, Modi and Jean moved in together. They had a child, a daughter, born in November of 1918, and incidentally, Modigliani's lover, Jean, sat for over 20 works done by Modigliani, and she wound up disregarding her own artistic career and wound up just being a model for her lover. In the many portraits of Jean, in that trademark Modigliani-esque style of the elongated shapes, long necks, oval face, swaths of color. And in her portrait that she did of Modigliani, you kind of see him through the eyes of a woman, his muse. She was selflessly in love with Modigliani, but she failed to make him abandon drugs and alcohol. She began to paint and draw, continued in the beginning years of her relationship, and before she met Modigliani, she aspired to be an artist. Now, there's noticeable differences in the way that Jean and Amadeo treat the same models that they painted around the same time. Modi creates an image with a personality behind it. If only Jean and Modi could have lived the way that Jean wanted to live as common law husband and wife, raising children, painting, creating art together, inspiring each other, they would have lived happily ever after. But unfortunately, Modigliani's drinking and his substance abuse effectively sabotaged any hope for any kind of a normal life that she had aspired to. And those aspirations died with too many public incidents of Modi's bad behavior. He smoked hashish, he drank to excess, he experienced alcohol-induced blackouts, passed out on the streets of Paris until he was picked up by the police. By 1920, most of Modigliani's friends in Montparnasse were fed up with him, and they deserted him as hopeless and incorrigible. Only one friend refused to abandon him, and that one friend was Jean. On the night of January 24th, the Modigliani's downstairs neighbor at the Rue de la Grande Chaumière, where they lived, knocked on the door after not seeing Amadeo or hearing either one of them for days. And the neighbor, when he finally forced his way into the apartment, discovered Modigliani in bed, delirious with fever, shaking, barely conscious, and lying in bed next to him was Jean with her arms wrapped around him in this desperate embrace. Modi was dying of tubercular meningitis. The distraught and frightened and confused Jean had not sent for a doctor. She refused to leave his side. And at some point, he must have caught pneumonia as well. But Jean was so desperate. She was about to give birth, was 8 months pregnant, that she just never called for help. Modigliani was overheard whispering to her on her deathbed, "Follow me when I die, so that in paradise you will be there and I will have my favorite model. Together we will share the joys of eternal life." Modigliani eventually passed away a few days later. He was 35 years old, and Jean was shattered and overcome with grief, and the bottom fell out from under her life. The prospect of life without Modigliani was unimaginable, intolerable, or probably both. Less than 48 hours after Modigliani died, Jean, who was 9 months pregnant with her second child, threw herself out of a fifth-floor window. She actually walked out backwards, and both she and her unborn child died in the fall. Jean Ebertarn was only 20 years old, and her suicide was the final act of allegiance, of protest, of determination. This shy, delicate, demure woman was not submissive. She made a decision. Over the past several decades, his reputation has soared. His lifestyle is kind of glamorized, his persona romanticized, and he is one of the most copied artists in the world. Now, this is where I would look out into the audience and see if you're really appreciating this, wiping a tear, and I know that you're enjoying it. Let's talk about a muse that Picasso had, Pablo Picasso and Doramar. The toxic love story between Pablo Picasso and Doramar is an iconic one, eventually leading the photographer Doramar to the brink of madness. Picasso began a 9-year relationship with Doramar while he was still involved with Marie-Therese Walter, who's shown in this image here, the blonde, beautiful woman. She was the mother of his 2-month-old daughter, Maya. Now, we first encountered the mesmerizing raven-haired Doramar when she was 29 years old and he was 54, and they met at the popular Café de Magot. And the artist meeting place at the moment was this very popular place. Many artists went there. And she was playing a game called a knife game, where she put her hand on the table, her fingers were splayed apart, and she played a knife game while music went faster and faster. And with the knife, you went between each finger, faster and faster and faster, until she hit one of her fingers, missed. The blood spurted on Picasso, and he said that's when he fell in love with her. As a matter of fact, he kept the glove that she was wearing that had a little drop of blood on it throughout his entire life as a souvenir of their meeting. When Doramar and Marie-Therese Walter later met in his studio, the ensuing argument degenerated into an all-out catfight between these two women, and that's an incident that Picasso would write as one of his choicest memories. Mar was Picasso's partner during the period of his greatest political engagement, but Picasso's most telling images of Mar, where her features are disturbingly reconfigured, growing out from everywhere in wrong places, shows us that she is literally breaking down in front of us. Doramar was seduced by Picasso's temperament, which she described as explosive. Soon, Mar began to revolve her whole life around the painter, abandoning her career as a photographer in order to take up painting. He was the most famous artist of the 20th century at the time, but one of the most notorious womanizers, and she was a rising French photographer at the time when he met her. She accompanied the painter on many of his travels until he decided to leave her for yet another woman. But Pablo Picasso made Doramar his muse as well as his lover. He painted portrait after portrait of her. But what's less known about this relationship was that she would turn the camera on him and portray this image that she had of him, of this very macho man who had total control over her. Mar was already 30 years old, forging a very successful career as a photographer and a painter. She had exhibited alongside Man Ray and Salvador Dali. She had traveled to London and Barcelona to document street life. But now, as Picasso's lover, she began to have major impact on his artistic work, and she felt that was more important to her than her own work. After a 9-year relationship with Picasso ended when he threw her over for a much younger Francois Gilo, she struggled to regain her emotional footing, and she was in such a mental state that she cried so much that she needed tranquilizers. Doramar suffered a complete mental collapse followed by nun-like seclusion. She lived out the rest of her days alone, immersed in the Catholic religion, haunted by the memories of the man that she once called her master. She very famously said, after Picasso, only God. Her art has been rediscovered since her death in 1990. Recently, her work has been rediscovered in 1997, and now she is acknowledged as much more than merely Picasso's partner. So let's take a look at the next woman that was in Pablo Picasso's life, Francois Gilo. She was only 21 years old when she first met Pablo in 1943. He was 62. One evening in Paris, the two happened to be dining in the same restaurant. Picasso was there with Doramar and a few friends, and Gilo was there with her friends. And at the end of the meal, Picasso walked over to Gilo's table and offered her a bowl of cherries with an invitation to visit his studio. That first evening in the cafe, Gilo told Picasso that she was a painter, and he said, "That's the funniest thing I've ever heard. Girls who look like you could never be painters." On the night they met, when Picasso invited her up to his studio, it seemed to Francois to be the beginning of an exciting life, offering her possibilities both in her personal life and her artistic career. Incidentally, she concealed her involvement with Picasso, who was, throughout his entire relationship with Francois, most of the relationship with Francois Gilo, he was married to a dancer by the name of Olga Koklova, and she's shown here. After a few years, Gilo moved in with Picasso, despite the fact that he was already married. And their relationship eventually produced two children, Claude and Paloma. Now, this is Olga Koklova, who was still traipsing around following Picasso when he eventually left her, and now he was with Francois Gilo. Now, just in case it should be thought that Picasso had things entirely his own way, his relationship with Francois Gilo was quite different. First of all, they had two children together, and she was this young law student, an aspiring young artist. She seems to have handled Picasso's cruelties and perversities with amazing skill, and she was the only woman to eventually leave Picasso entirely voluntarily on her own with her dignity and more or less intact. She began this affair with Picasso, even though he said to her on the first night that he met her, "Women are machines for suffering. For me, there are only two kinds of women, goddesses and doormats. Which one are you?" Throughout the years, Francois had to put up with his domineering character and his unfaithfulness, but she would always say, "Is domestic stability good for Picasso's art?" When he captured Gilo's features in a series of drawings that he did of her, this was a period where his work was being most recognized. He was living this millionaire's life on the Côte d'Azur. He was cut off from external reality, and it was very easy for him to play Picasso, this image that he created in real life. Now, Francois became very annoyed by Picasso's affairs and eventually leaves him in 1953. After their breakup, she seems to have been the only woman with enough strength to get over Picasso and get on with her life. She went on to publish a book about her life with Picasso, this 10-year relationship she had with him, and it became a bestseller, Life with Picasso. Over 1 million hardcover copies were sold within the first year, and it was on the bestseller list for several months. Well, this outraged Picasso. He never actually read the book because he couldn't read in English, and she wrote it in English. And he immediately seeks an injunction against the publisher to stop further publication of the book. He was unsuccessful on 3 separate attempts, and the book was eventually published in 5 different languages. When Francois Gilo decided to take her young children and leave Picasso in 1953, that ended that 10-year relationship, and it infuriated Picasso. And he told her that you are headed straight for the desert because no one will ever have anything kind to say about you except the curiosity of the person who has touched my heart. Well, he was wrong. Life after Picasso had been a continuing adventure for Francois. She got married, she had another child, many friendships, 2 best-selling books, a successful career, and she was an artist who continued up until the age of 90 to paint every day. In one of her many interviews, she says firmly with her clear French accented English, "I am not going to talk about Picasso. I've done my duty to those memories. I have a great career as an artist by myself. I'm not just here because I've spent time with Picasso." Now, in one interview I saw of her, she brought out these 2 oversized volumes documenting all of her work, which numbers into 1,600 paintings, 4,000 works on paper, sketches, a number of books that she's written, but always she finds a way to talk about Picasso and weave it into the conversation, even though she refuses to let those comments dominate the interview. She said in one interview that I saw with her, she said, "I actually fell in love with Matisse, not Picasso. Matisse was my god. I'm a French artist, that's for sure, and I'm color-oriented, kind of a composer. I'm not pouring my guts out like Picasso does. I keep them inside like Matisse." There's so much in Matisse's art that is not said but implied. He doesn't disgorge his intestines in front of me. Now, in addition to being Picasso's model and muse, she was his intellectual equal. And a relationship with him, she wrote in her memoir, was a catastrophe that I just didn't want to avoid. After 1964, anyone who wanted to be friends with Picasso or be admitted into his studio had to denounce Francois' memoir in writing. In the years after Gilo and Picasso broke up, he tried to ruin her. He badmouthed her across the whole industry. And she said, "So what? I would have been quite stupid to expect anything else from him. In life, you have to measure the quantity of danger that you can afford. You know, had I not thought that if I didn't think that I was up to it, I wouldn't have done it. I would not have stayed." She said, "When I left Picasso, I knew I would have a lot of enemies." One of the reasons, interestingly, that she came to the US in 1961 is she thought that people would be less judgmental of her here in the US. And she noticed that about 80% of her collectors were American, and she figured they admired her for her work, not just her relationship with Picasso. She eventually moved to America, tried to escape Picasso's orbit, and in spite of him, her work kept selling. On a trip to Los Angeles in 1969, a friend of hers introduced her to Jonas Salk. She had no interest in meeting him. She said scientists are boring. But soon afterward, he came to New York and invited her to have tea. And she said he didn't have tea. He ordered pistachio and tangerine ice cream. And I thought, well, a scientist who orders pistachio and tangerine ice cream at 5 o'clock in the afternoon is not like everyone else. So she pursued a relationship with him, and after a few months, he asked her to marry him, and she balked and said, "I don't need to be married. In my position, I cannot be married." She said, "He gave me 2 pieces of paper and told me to write down the reasons why I didn't want to get married. And her first list said, I can't live more than 6 months with one person. I have all my own children. I don't want more. I have a career as a painter and I have to go here and there and I don't want someone tagging behind. And I'm not always in the mood to talk." And he said, "Interesting." In 1970, she eventually did marry Jonas Salk, a pioneering scientist who invented the first polio vaccine. And she remained with him until he died in 1995. What's interesting and the irony behind Francois Gilo is that she waited most of her life for the world to catch up with her. How about Wassily Kandinsky and Gabrielle Munter? Gabrielle Munter was a German expressionist painter who was at the forefront of the Munich avant-garde early 20th century painters. When the young Gabrielle Munter appeared in Kandinsky's art class, she was 25 years old and he was 36, and he was married to another woman by the name of Anna. She was 6 years his senior, and they began he was 6 years older. That math isn't right. Anyway, they began a friendship of kindred spirits, which grew into love. I'm sorry, Anna was 6 years older than Wassily Kandinsky. So they ignored the fact that Kandinsky was married, incidentally. They moved in together. 1 year later, they got engaged. Now remember, he's still married to Anna, and they started this secret life. Their relationship was nourished with both of them creating this wave of emotional and creative intimacy that came out in their canvases, and they found their own unique style in this collaboration of these two artists. She was pleased with that, but upset with the fact that her personal life was not exactly what she wanted. She was already 30. She had spent 5 years with Kandinsky, who never really said he would divorce his former wife. He was still married to this other woman, and she was putting up with his excuses one after the other. In 1911, Kandinsky officially divorced Anna, and he traveled extensively with Gabrielle, eventually settling in Bavaria before the outbreak of World War I. World War I eventually took him back to Russia, where his artistic eye was influenced by the constructivist movement based on hard lines and dots and geometry. In 1911, after a successful Stockholm exhibition, which had been organized by Gabrielle, Kandinsky returns to Russia, and he promises Gabrielle that he will arrange for documents for them to be married. In the winter of 1917, he eventually did get married, but not to Gabrielle. While he was in Russia, the 50-year-old Kandinsky had met and married Nina, 17-year-old art student of his, and he confessed to Nina that he first fell in love with her by the sound of her voice, and he recorded her voice on this canvas. They had a son together. The boy lived, unfortunately, for only 3 years and eventually died of meningitis. Gabrielle now unsuccessfully tried to find out where he was. She was waiting for him to come back to her because they were supposed to be married. She wrote letters and they remained unanswered. Only 4 years later, in 1921, without any warning, Kandinsky sends a letter to her from his lawyer demanding from Gabrielle to return all of his personal belongings and artworks. Well, Gabrielle didn't return anything, and she said, "I kept them as moral compensation." As a result, Kandinsky suffered a nervous breakdown. She continued to lead a secluded life. In the years of fascism, when this objectless, degenerate art was outlawed, the archive and the world of Kandinsky and the work of Gabrielle Munter was hidden in the basement of her home because the work was considered to be degenerate, and there were serious consequences to show this kind of modern art. In spite of her financial problems, she preserved his paintings with care during World War II. And even though she had several house searches with people looking for this degenerate art, they never found the artwork that she had hidden. On her 80th birthday, Munter gave her entire collection of Kandinsky work, which consisted of more than 80 oil paintings and 330 drawings, to a gallery in Munich. Munter was Vasily Kandinsky's partner on the front lines of the avant-garde movement at a time when their paintings were so similar that you could hardly tell them apart. She was pegged very early on as his student and his lover rather than his peer. And their relationship ended. After their relationship ended, he went on to become very renowned, and she stopped painting and was completely unrecognized for decades. In the eyes of many, she said, "I was only an unnecessary side dish to Kandinsky. It's all too easy to be forgotten and forget that a woman can be a creative artist with a real original talent of her own." Our next couple is Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. When these two Mexican artists locked eyes, Frida Kahlo was still recovering from an accident where she had injured her spine and her legs. She was bedridden. Kahlo created a rich collection of self-portraits with the help of a canvas that was fixed above her bed. Diego Rivera was instantly seduced by these paintings, which were described by him as vital sensuality, further enriched by the pitiless, sensitive way of observation, the way that she created her work. United through their love, they shared a cultural identity and a revolutionary belief in politics, and eventually the couple married in August of 1929. Their marriage was punctuated by their immense success in the art world. Their shared travels and encounters were as some of the greatest artists of their time. The marriage between what was considered to be an elephant and a dove was how Frida Kahlo's mother described the union of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. He was one of the most famous mural artists in Mexico. He was 42 years old. She was 22, and she was already he was already painting huge murals on a number of buildings when they eventually met and fell in love. She saw him at work in 1927 and saw him from scaffolding and looked down on him, threw down her sketchbook to him, and asked him to take a look at her work. And although he never really did, eventually when he recognized her was after the horrible accident that she had. But it was the start of one of the most creative, collaborative, and boisterous love affairs of all time. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo had diametrically opposed artistic styles. She was fascinated with the personal and intimate images that she created. Many of them were self-portraits, and he was interested in the grand sweep of Mexican history. She was in awe of his talents. She said he was the best painter of their times and predicted that the world would speak of him as one of the greatest artists. They gave each other space. They lived in two separate houses linked by a bridge. They understood that a partnership should be enabling and never stifling, she said. But there were troubles, especially affairs, especially his liaison that he had with her sister, Christina. In 1939, they divorced, and then they quickly realized that they couldn't live without each other. And they remarried the following year, but Frida Kahlo laid down this condition, that since he was already with her sister, they would have financial independence and no sex. Her painting, called The Wounded Deer, is a self-portrait from those years when they were separate. She saw herself as wounded by the arrows, but still surviving. She was all about resilience, both in her marriage and her enduring a terrible physical suffering from injuries that she had sustained on a bus accident in 1925. As well as the emotional pain of the affair and miscarriages and childlessness. She realized that her partnership with Rivera was not just about fidelity or finance, but that it was a broad brushstroke in detail. She said, individuals in a marriage often have different ways of expressing their love. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo's relationship is arguably one of the most well-known and documented in history. In art history. The Mexican artists and painters successfully had careers respectively throughout their very tumultuous relationship. Frida Kahlo's surrealist painting called Self-Portrait is one she calls Thinking of Diego. And it's a representation as Diego as her third eye. So let's move into more modern times, Charles and Ray Eames. For more than a decade, the American designers Charles and Ray Eames helped shape nearly every facet of American life. From their architecture and furniture and textile designs to their photography and corporate design, this husband and wife team exerted a profound influence on the visual character of daily life in America, whether at work or at home. Their pioneering use of materials and technologies, notably plywood and plastics, transformed the way Americans furnish their homes, introducing functional, affordable, and highly sculptural furnishings to middle-class Americans. Charles and they eventually met while attending the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield, Michigan. And from the beginning of their collaborative partnership, they focused on creating multifunctional modern design. While at Cranbrook, they collaborated on a group of wooden furniture designs that won them the Museum of Modern Art's 1940 Organic Design in Home Furnishings competition. With these designs, which included experimental molded plywood chairs, they were conceived as functional, affordable options for consumers seeking modern yet livable domestic surroundings. This proved to be furniture design that lasted decades. One of their most recognized design is the Eames lounge chair that they collaborated on together. The goal was to mold a single piece of plywood into a chair, and the organic chair was born out of this idea. The chair won first prize, but its form was unable to be successfully mass-produced. Eames considered it to be a failure, as the tooling for molding this chair from a single piece of wood had not yet been invented at this point. Ray was extremely instrumental with the graphic design of this particular chair. Now, the pair hit it off immediately, and by May of 1941, the smitten Eames had divorced his first wife and wrote a love letter proposing to Ray in the most romantic of ways. Needless to say, she accepted a month later, and they were married June 17, 1941 in Chicago. Their honeymoon was a road trip in which they relocated permanently from the Midwest to Los Angeles, California, where they continued to design their furniture, working with molded plywood. During World War II, they were commissioned by the U.S. Navy to produce molded plywood splints, stretchers, and experimental glider shells. By 1946, the products, which were now called Evans products, began to produce the Eames molded plywood furniture, and the molded plywood chair was called the Chair of the Century by the influential architects of the time. Soon production was taken over by Herman Miller Incorporated, who continued to produce the furniture well into the United States many years later, and is still available today. In 1949, Charles and Ray designed and built their own home in Pacific Palisades, California, as part of the Case Study House program sponsored by the Arts and Architects magazine. And their design was an innovative use of materials. The house became a mecca for architects and designers, both near and far. And today, it's considered one of the most important post-war residences anywhere in the world. Another tragic love story, Camille Claudel and Auguste Rodin. Auguste Rodin was 41 years old, on the verge of critical and commercial success, when he meets 17-year-old Camille Claudel in 1882. And she showed early promise as a sculptor, and Rodin, struck by her talent and her beauty, hired her as his assistant when he was commissioned by the French Ministry of Fine Arts to work on a public project, his first large-scale project. He was asked to create an entire entrance for a museum of decorative arts to be built in Paris. And his main source of inspiration for the doorway, which he was going to call the Gates of Hell, was the epic poem, The Divine Comedy. That was his inspiration for this portal. But the task was overwhelming, and he didn't know where to begin. So the very determined, ambitious young Camille Claudel was driven to learn everything that she could from Rodin, who she considered to be a genius, and she decided to help him create this portal. With the help of Camille Claudel, Rodin eventually created the project and worked on a number of the elements in the doorway with the collaborative effort of Camille Claudel. In letters that he wrote to Claudel, he would often speak of her and their relationship as a passion-driven inspiration. Several of his most important independent pieces that were in this portal, the Gates of Hell, were created by Camille Claudel, like The Thinker, The Kiss, and Dianade. They were all derived from smaller reliefs contained within the portal that was created for the Gates of Hell. And he would often exhibit larger versions of these independent sculptures that were incorporated as freestanding sculptures, and never gave even a hint of credit to Camille Claudel for her creation of these pieces. During the long hours spent working together, they developed an affection for each other that eventually led to an intense love affair fueled by their common passion for sculpture. Their work during these happy times reflects the inspiration that they derived from their mutual admiration for each other, the love and feelings that they would have that would influence their art throughout their careers. As a direct result of the intense relationship with Camille Claudel, Rodin eventually reached the height of his career and was regarded in Europe and America as one of the greatest sculptors since Michelangelo. His dramatic figures were raw with emotion, pioneered modern sculpture with this new emphasis and movement that Camille Claudel helped him to bring into his expression, and the expression and determination of the soul that she put into her work is what made his work very important and recognized. Now, an expert on Rodin and Claudel recognize this in the work of Rodin during this time, and this is an excerpt from what was written by an art critic at the time. He recognizes her torsos as well as her head, hands, and feet of most of Rodin's work exhibited during this time, and he writes much of Rodin's work passed between Camille Claudel's hands. This work embodies Claudel's naturalistic style, not the tension and characteristics that are characteristic of Rodin's work. In addition, he writes, it was very well known fact that Rodin did not sculpt in marble. He preferred clay, and Camille Claudel excelled in it. Most of these pieces are done in marble. While their influence on each other lasted, their relationship did not. And by the early 1890s, both their personal and professional relationships began to dissolve. Now, several factors contributed to the deterioration of Rodin and Claudel's relationship. He was now enjoying worldwide critical success, and his reputation, along with his powerful connections in the art world, made him a very influential figure. But he never made any reference to the influence that he had with the work that Camille Claudel contributed to. Now, he could help make or break other artists' careers, and regarding Claudel's work, critics often referred to her as Rodin's student and constantly compared her sculptures to Rodin's as if her talent was derived mostly from her ability to imitate her teacher. She was never given credit for her contributions to improving the quality of his work. Now, she resented this association, and because of that, she started resenting Rodin as well, and she purposefully distanced herself from Rodin in her determination to establish herself as an artist in her own right. Added to this resentment was her frustration with having to endure the prejudice against women artists, especially women sculptors, and the lack of educational and professional opportunities. And another obstacle during this relationship was Rodin's relationship with his longtime companion and model, Rose Beret. Although he was deeply in love with Claudel, and he wrote her many letters telling her that, he would not leave Rose, who he had lived with and had a child with, although he never acknowledged, for almost 25 years. Now, his failure to leave Rose Beret became intolerable, and Claudel's jealousy over this situation, along with her continued resentment and frustration, caused her to break things off with Rodin for good. After their breakup, their lives took different paths. Rodin's career soared. Critics confirmed him as the most famous artist in the world, and he was frequently referred to as the greatest sculptor since Michelangelo. He continued to approach art collectors, journalists, and government officials to recommend Camille Claudel's work, although he never really followed through. He said he would support her financially, but she never received money from him. They may have influenced each other equally, but there was no equality in what he eventually got from the relationship compared to her. It's documented in the many pieces that were signed by Rodin that they were actually pieces done by Camille Claudel. She eventually withdrew into solitude. Her incessant struggle to separate herself artistically from Rodin, along with her bitter resentment over his relationship with Rose Beret, took a toll on her mental state. She continued creating sculptures, many of them based on themes that emerged during her relationship with Rodin, and her career, as well as her mental state, steeply declined. She was eventually committed to a mental institution by her family in 1913, where she spent the remaining 30 years of her life in seclusion. You can't help but question whether Rodin and Camille Claudel would have flourished creatively had they not influenced each other. Think how resounding their art may have been had they stayed together, or maybe the genius resided in this torrid madness of a failed love. Incidentally, today there is a museum dedicated to the works of Camille Claudel, and she is now finally getting recognition for the work that she influenced of Rodin's. Alfred Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe, famous couple from 1915 till 1946, some 25,000 pieces of paper were exchanged between these two major 20th century artists, painter Georgia O'Keeffe and photographer Alfred Stieglitz. They wrote each other letters, sometimes 2 and 3 a day, sometimes 40 pages long. And their correspondence tracks their relationship from acquaintance to admirer to lover to man and wife, exasperated but still together, a long married couple. When Stieglitz and O'Keeffe met in 1916, he was 52 and famous. He was an internationally acclaimed photographer. He had an avant-garde gallery in Manhattan. She, on the other hand, was 28 and unknown. Stieglitz was the most important person in the New York art world at the time, and O'Keeffe was a school teacher teaching art in Texas. The letters that they wrote during the time after they met tell a deepening relationship. He said, "I'm getting to like you so tremendously that sometimes it scares me." She said, "Having told you so much of me, more than anyone else I know, could anything else follow? Could there be more to follow? I want you." Stieglitz becomes her guide and her mentor. He exhibits her work in his gallery without her permission. And unannounced, she visits him in New York and is irate over this. And she's about to return to Texas after telling him off for using her artwork in his gallery without her permission. And he eventually convinces her to stay. He said, "I want to photograph you, your hands, your mouth, your eyes, the envelopment of your body, the touch of white, your throat. I don't want to break into your time, but I want to get to know you." And now he's really beginning to yearn for her. He's miserable in his first marriage. He sees her not as O'Keeffe the artist, but as O'Keeffe the woman that he wants to get to know. And years later, when he photographs her, she called it kind of a heat between us, these images that he created, the photographs. Stieglitz was an immensely charismatic person, amazingly egotistical and a narcissist, but he had this ability to establish a deep communion with people. And she writes to him, "All I want is to preserve that wonderful something which so purely exists between us." So she decides to move to New York. And before she arrives, he writes her a letter and he says, "What do I want from you? What do I want from you, you ask me? Sometimes I feel like I'm going stark mad, that I ought to say, you are so much to me that you must not even come near me, because coming near me may bring you darkness instead of light, and you should live in everlasting light." That was the first warning letter to her. Stieglitz worries that he won't be able to provide for her. She doesn't have a head for business, but she eventually decides to come and be completely dependent on him. He gets her a small studio. He said, "All I want to do is preserve that something that is so pure between us." And they begin living together almost immediately. Eventually they marry in 1924. they were entranced with each other, passionately in love. And yet, by the mid-20s, the late 20s, difficulties started creeping into the relationship, and you could start seeing cracks in their letters. O'Keeffe deeply wants to have a child. Stieglitz does not. The couple lives with Stieglitz's family, which proves to be very difficult for O'Keeffe. They spend most of their time at Lake George every summer and most falls. And at that time, Georgia O'Keeffe is feeling like she's being crowded by this family. Eventually, because of his displaying her work and him promoting her, she becomes a famous artist, and that's in large part just his promotion of her work. She grows increasingly restless, and according to her biographer, she starts making little trips. And in the summer of 1929, she decides to go to New Mexico, which was a decision that would change their lives forever. She's now 42. She's coming alive in Mexico. She finds the subjects and colors that will place her in every major museum. And her letters now are full of adventure and sunshine and happiness. Well, back in New York, Stieglitz, who is now 65, is falling apart. He says, "I'm broken. I'm desperate. I've lost my will, and I know I will never get her back." After 2 months away from him, she explains to him that her time away from him created a lot of life in her. She said, "I was always moving towards you. Now I'm moving away from you. And I realize that I will die if I do not move more away from you and towards something else." She said, "Coming here made me feel good and makes me feel like I'm growing very tall and straight and very still. And maybe you will not love me for it, because it seems to me that the best thing I can do for you is hope that this letter does not hurt you. That's the last thing I want to do in the world." And she finishes the letter by saying, "Today it rains for you." This letter expresses what many modern women feel, which is the reconciliation of the desire for work and art, but this tie-up that she has in a marriage that she's no longer connected to. They did, however, have a very modern marriage that lasted with changes and variations and temptations and his infidelities and, of course, all the letters. Eventually, Stieglitz dies in 1946. Each of them groped for personal fulfillment, and they both achieved so much. In the history of art and music and literature, the life and the work of these artists is passionate and unusual, and at times very stormy, these love affairs between creative spirits. So with Valentine's this month, I thought it might be fun to celebrate those famous couples who collaborated professionally, often with extraordinary results. They say that there's no fate worse than dating an artist, and we see what happens when one creative artist falls in love with another. Famous artists are often eclectic and captivating individuals. They often spend time with fellow creatives, building close friendships and sometimes romantic relationships. Due to the strong personalities of each individual, these romantic relationships are often highly creative and collaborative, but run the risk of being chaotic and destructive until they find that something works and they go on to live happily ever after. They all have one thing in common, though. Each relationship led to the artist creating some of their best works. And that's the story of love and art.
Thank you, Felicia. Looks like we have a couple questions. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to put them in our Q&A box below. Eileen asked, so many of these relationships had some element of dysfunction. Who had a faithful relationship that was mostly happy, egalitarian, and enduring? Anybody, or is there too much ego in the life of a famous artist?
Actually, Cezanne was married to the same woman and in love with her for years. Monet cared for his wife until she eventually died, and then married the woman who cared for her and stayed with her for many years. Although Rodin had a lot of affairs, he did love Alina, and often created paintings devoted to his life, but he was a bit of a womanizer. But I would say Monet and Cezanne were probably the two that come to mind quickly.
We have a couple compliments, Felicia. Wow, thanks as always. Love the program. Thank you for a wonderful program. Felicia, as always. Oops, I lost it. Where did it go? Felicia, as always, so wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your presentation was wonderful. Thank you. Sounds like everybody really enjoyed it, Felicia, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Does anyone have any questions for Felicia? Okay, wait, we have a couple hands raised. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, let's see. I'm having a hard time seeing who had their hand raised because we have so many people here tonight.
That's great.
Allison, I let Marley talk.
Okay. Marley, did you have a question for Felicia?
I think you're muted.
Yeah, because it says ask to unmute. Couple people are asking Felicia, when do you have lectures going on anywhere else?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to answer that way. I was just thinking off the top of my head. Mentor Library has a couple lectures coming up. Rocky River Senior Center has one a month on a Wednesday. They're generally in the morning around 11. Let me look at my schedule here and see which ones that are open to. Beechwood Library is starting in March. We'll be doing that once a month on Fridays. A few other locations that we're still working on dates, but I can let Allison know when we'll have the lectures and what the subjects are, and we can always connect through there.
Felicia, Dell or Edward asked, do you have one main resource that you get your information from? I know you always like to use the primary source documents. Where do you get a lot of your letters and all that from?
I just dig through a lot of different things and validate the information and then, put it together. But it's mostly the letters that the artists write themselves, either to each other, about other artists, or the journals that they write. So I try to base my information and go to the letters of the individual artists in their own words. And that's where we get a lot of information. We know a lot about Picasso because everybody wrote about him in their letters and journals. And he wrote a lot about himself as well, or had other people write for him. But mostly the journals and letters. And I've got librarians around that send me information, books, publications. Smithsonian has a lot of documents, letters that you can read. Rodin's story is documented, very detailed information about Rodin and Camille Claudel through their each individual letters. So you can really put that together and see a complete picture at a variety of different places.
Susan asked which one of the couples that you talked about tonight were the most interesting for you to research?
I think that's a really good question. I think the Eames couple, that collaboration where they were working together in an academic atmosphere, they came up with this pioneering new idea and they marketed it. She brought in the design, he brought in the physical aspects. That intrigued me because it's long lasting. You know, the fact that you can still buy Eames chairs, the style of that work is still existent. It's almost like Schreckengost, where it became part of our life as opposed to just art. So they really left an indelible impression on me.
Okay. I think that's it. Did I get everybody's?
Well, thank you once again for inviting me into your homes. Yeah. And I hope at some point we'll get to see each other.
Another wonderful lecture and joining us tonight. Felicia, is always nice to work with you and nice to see you, and we're always excited to learn what you have to share with us.
Well, thank you again. I look forward to the next one.
Okay. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.